History often hides its most haunting truths in photographs. Not in textbooks, not in dusty archives, but in fleeting images, frozen seconds before the world changed forever. These photos are more than memories. They are whispers of lives interrupted, empires collapsing, inventions forgotten, and moments that should never have existed. Imagine staring at a bride walking through the ruins of war, determined to marry even as bombs reduced her home to rubble. Picture a little boy, his childhood lost in the dust of a migrant camp, his eyes older than his years. Or an actress 8 months pregnant buying baby clothes, unaware that her destiny was about to be shattered by violence. Each of these images tells a story the world was not meant to forget, yet most of them remain hidden, buried in history's shadows. Today, we will bring them back into the light. Each photo is not only a window into the past, it is a mirror, reflecting the fragility of life, the cruelty of war, and the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. Stay with me, because the pictures you're about to see will change the way you look at history forever. Survivors of Munich Allah Camp, the 30th of April, 1945. On a spring morning, the 30th of April, 1945, weary survivors of the Munich Allah concentration camp raised trembling arms in salute. Not to their captors, but to the liberators of the US 42nd Infantry Division. Their faces bore scars of hunger and fear, but in their eyes burned something stronger: relief, disbelief, and the first fragile taste of freedom. Allah was a subcamp of Dachau, one of the darkest corners of Nazi Germany's machinery of terror. By the time the Americans arrived, the prisoners had endured years of starvation, disease, and brutality. Yet in that single photograph, the salute to the US soldiers, you see the essence of survival: bones wrapped in skin, but spirits unbroken. This was the day Adolf Hitler ended his own life in Berlin. But here, hundreds of miles away, life was returning to those who had been written off for death. A salute, a gesture so simple, became a silent promise: we are still here, we survived. Sharon Tate's final days, a smile before the darkness. In the summer of 1969, Los Angeles shimmered with golden sunlight, the air heavy with the promise of change. In a boutique window, Sharon Tate, actress, model, and the very embodiment of youthful beauty, was seen tenderly holding baby clothes. Her smile was radiant, her hands lingering over the soft fabric. She was 8 months pregnant, eagerly awaiting the arrival of her first child. But this photograph, so ordinary and innocent, is now unbearable to look at, because just days later, Sharon Tate's life was brutally stolen. On the 9th of August, 1969, she was murdered in her own home by followers of Charles Manson, a name forever etched into America's darkest nightmares. The tragedy shocked the world. Hollywood's dreamland was ripped apart, innocence shattered, and fear seeped into every glamorous home of Beverly Hills. For many, Sharon became the haunting symbol of a decade that began with freedom and love, but ended in blood and chaos. That photograph of her holding baby clothes, so fragile, so human, remains one of the most chilling reminders of how quickly joy can turn into despair. A single image, now frozen forever, captures the cruel irony of a mother preparing for life while death was already at her doorstep. The last Atlas lion, 1925. High in the rugged Atlas Mountains of North Africa, once roamed a beast so majestic it seemed untouchable: the Atlas lion. Larger and more powerful than any other lion, with a dark, thick mane that cascaded down its shoulders, it was the very image of wild nobility. For centuries, it stood as a symbol of strength in Moroccan and Algerian folklore, feared by hunters, revered by kings. But in 1925, a French photographer named Marcelin Flandrin unknowingly captured the final chapter of this creature's story. His lens focused on a lone male, prowling against the rocky landscape. The photo is haunting, not because of what it shows, but because of what it represents. That image is the last known photograph of the Atlas lion in the wild. Relentless hunting, shrinking habitats, and the spread of human settlements had driven the species to the edge. By the time Flandrin's shutter clicked, the great lion's fate was already sealed. Within decades, the king of the Atlas would vanish completely from its natural home. Looking at that picture today, you can almost feel the silence that followed. An empty wilderness where once echoed the roar of giants, a vanished presence, leaving only faded photographs and whispered legends. The Atlas lion, once a ruler of mountains, now survives only in memory its extinction, a stark warning of how easily humanity can silence nature's most powerful voices. The children who were mailed. America, 1913. It sounds like a strange folk tale, something too absurd to be real, but it happened. In 1913, when the United States Postal Service first launched its parcel post system, a loophole in the regulations allowed something shocking. Parents could mail their own children as packages. Yes, children sent through the mail. At the time, postage was far cheaper than buying a train ticket, and many rural families lived in deep poverty. So they wrapped their children in warm clothes, pinned stamps to their coats, and entrusted them to the postman. The children were placed in mail cars, traveling alongside letters and parcels, delivered to relatives as if they were freight. The practice was rare, but it was real. One little boy was mailed 73 miles to his grandmother. Another child, weighing just under the parcel limit, was delivered for a mere 15 cents in postage. Postal workers, often neighbors or friends, quietly carried out these unusual deliveries until the government swiftly outlawed the practice. Looking back, the photographs of those tiny faces peeking out from postal wagons are both unsettling and oddly touching. They remind us of a time when desperation and trust in community blurred the lines between logic and love. It's a chapter of history almost too bizarre to believe children stamped, weighed, and carried like letters, yet always delivered into waiting arms. A Bride Among the Ruins. London, 1940. London, 1940. The city was scarred, its streets littered with bricks and ash after night upon night of German bombs. Homes lay in ruins, families torn apart, and the sound of air raid sirens haunted every dusk. And yet, in the middle of this devastation, a bride stepped carefully through the rubble. Her dress was white, pure, and defiant against the grey wreckage of war. Behind her, the skeleton of what once had been her family home stood as a silent witness, but she did not pause to mourn. She was on her way to marry. This photograph of a bride walking to her wedding amid bombed-out London remains one of the most powerful images of the human spirit's resilience. It tells us that even when death rained from the skies, life refused to be silenced. The young woman's determined steps through destruction embodied a message louder than the Blitz itself. Hope would not surrender. She carried not just flowers and vows that day, but also the weight of a nation's resolve. A symbol that even in the darkest moments, people would find love, laughter, and reasons to keep going. One picture, one bride, one wedding dress against the ruins, an eternal reminder that love is the greatest rebellion against war. The ducking stool. Punishment in medieval England. Centuries before the modern justice system, public punishment was as much about humiliation as it was about law. Among the most feared instruments was the ducking stool, a heavy wooden chair mounted on a long beam. It was used to plunge the condemned, often women, into cold, filthy water again and again, while crowds jeered from the banks. In medieval England, and well into the 15th century, this device was reserved for those accused of slander, gossip, or worse, witchcraft. Imagine the terror of being strapped to that chair, hands bound as the beam creaked and the crowd chanted. Then, with a crash, the chair plunged downward, water swallowing you whole. Gasping for breath, shivering and choking, you were dragged up only to be dunked again. One such stool stood near the infamous Clink prison in London, a place already drenched in stories of cruelty. To the authorities, the ducking stool was correction. To the people, it was spectacle. And to the victims, it was a slow drowning, a punishment of fear and degradation rather than justice. The photograph of the medieval device reminds us how brutality often hid beneath the mask of order. It shows that for much of history, cruelty was entertainment, and human suffering a public performance. The flight that lasted 2-3 days, the Hunter brothers, 1930. In the summer of 1930, the roar of an airplane engine echoed endlessly across the skies of Illinois. Inside the cockpit sat the Hunter brothers, 4 daring aviators, determined to break the boundaries of endurance. Their mission? To stay aloft longer than anyone ever had before. For 23 days, their plane circled overhead without ever touching the ground. They ate in the air, slept in shifts, and even carried out mechanical repairs mid-flight. A famous photograph captures Kenneth Hunter, strapped precariously to the fuselage, reaching out to check the engine while the aircraft soared thousands of feet above the earth. The feat was made possible by another airplane that flew alongside them, lowering fuel and food through ropes in daring mid-air exchanges. It was dangerous, exhausting, and almost unthinkable by today's standards. But to the Hunter brothers, it was proof that the sky could be conquered with courage and ingenuity. When they finally landed, after 553 hours of flight, they had set a record that stunned the world. Their endurance flight became a symbol of the boundless ambition of the early aviation age, a time when flying was not routine, but an act of defiance against the impossible. The image of Kenneth dangling from the plane, tools in hand, remains one of the most thrilling snapshots of human daring, a reminder that history is not only written on the ground but also high above the clouds. Stalin's daughter, on Beria's lap, a disturbing photograph, 1931. Some photographs become chilling only in hindsight when history reveals the shadows behind the smiles. One such image shows a little girl, Svetlana Stalin, perched on the lap of Lavrenti Beria in 1931. Behind them stands her father, Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist. At first glance, it looks innocent, a child sitting comfortably, her father watching over. But Beria was no kindly family friend. He was the ruthless head of Soviet state security, one of Stalin's closest collaborators, and the architect of mass arrests, torture, and executions during the Great Purge. To later generations, the photograph is almost unbearable, an image of innocence placed in the arms of a predator. Svetlana would grow up haunted by the men who surrounded her father, men who carried out unspeakable acts in his name. Beria, in particular, became infamous not only for his political brutality, but also for his cruelty and abuse in private life. The photograph freezes a moment that, to those who know the history, feels grotesque. A dictator's daughter smiling on the lap of the man who embodied terror. It is a reminder that history often hides its darkest truths behind masks of normalcy, and that even a family picture can carry the weight of nightmares. A boy from Migrant, Texas, the dust of survival, 1939. The year was 1939, and America was still trapped in the grip of the Great Depression. In Edinburgh, Texas, a photographer captured the face of a boy, the son of migrant workers, standing inside a small makeshift home. His eyes told a story far older than his years, gazing out with a mixture of weariness and quiet defiance. Families like his lived a life of constant motion, following the harvest from one field to the next, uprooted again and again in search of work. Theirs was a world of dust, sweat, and uncertainty. Children slept on dirt floors, carried water in tin cans, and often labored alongside their parents under the burning Sunday school was a fleeting luxury, stability an impossible dream. The photograph of that boy is more than a portrait. It is the face of a generation who grew up knowing nothing but hardship. Yet in his stare, you sense something unbroken, a stubborn resilience that refused to be erased by poverty. These children, hardened too soon by life, became the invisible backbone of America's agricultural survival. When we look at him today, we don't just see one child. We see the countless forgotten young lives shaped in the shadows of economic despair, children who bore the weight of survival before they ever had the chance to simply be young. Stalin and Truman at Potsdam, Smiles After the Storm, 1945. The summer of 1945 marked both an ending and a beginning. World War II in Europe was over. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and entire nations faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Yet in Potsdam, Germany, a photograph captured two men smiling as if they stood on the edge of a new world, Joseph Stalin and Harry S. Truman. The Potsdam Conference was meant to shape the post-war order. The Allied leaders, Stalin of the Soviet Union, Truman of the United States, and Winston Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee, gathered to redraw Europe's borders, determine the fate of Germany, and negotiate terms for Japan's surrender. In the picture, Stalin and Truman appear cordial, even relaxed, their grins betraying none of the tension beneath the surface. But history tells us another story. Behind those smiles was a fragile alliance already beginning to crack. The seeds of the Cold War were being planted even as the ink dried on agreements. Truman, newly thrust into leadership after Roosevelt's death, eyed Stalin's ambitions with suspicion. Stalin, in turn, sought to expand Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. The photograph is almost surreal, two men laughing in the ruins of a continent, unaware that their uneasy friendship would soon harden into one of history's most dangerous rivalries. It is an image that reminds us, peace can be just another battlefield, disguised by handshakes and smiles. 30,000 Nazi firearms seized in Norway. Stavanger Airfield, 1,945. In the quiet aftermath of Nazi Germany's surrender, the world began the monumental task of dismantling its war machine. One striking photograph from Stavanger, Norway, shows a depot overflowing with rifles, pistols, and machine guns, part of the staggering 30,000 firearms seized from German forces after the occupation ended in 1945. Laid out in neat, almost ceremonial rows, these weapons once symbolized terror and domination. Now, they were stripped of power, reduced to relics of a defeated army. The scene is both eerie and strangely beautiful. Deadly instruments of war stacked like discarded tools, waiting to be catalogued, melted, or destroyed. For Norwegians, the collection was more than just military spoils, it was liberation made tangible. Each confiscated rifle was a reminder of oppression lifted, each weapon a token of survival. The Allies, in organizing these stockpiles, were not just disarming an enemy, they were cleansing a nation, ensuring that those guns would never again fire upon the innocent. Looking at the photo today, you can almost feel the silence of the airfield, a silence heavy with relief, yet haunted by the memory of what those weapons had done. In that silence, the story shifts from the sound of marching boots and gunfire to the quiet promise of peace. Hitler's sister Paula, captured by the Allies, 1945. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, the Allied armies scoured Europe not only for generals and ministers, but also for the family of Adolf Hitler. Among those they found was his youngest sister, Paula. A photograph taken at the time shows her being detained by US forces, an ordinary-looking woman suddenly thrust into history's spotlight. Unlike her infamous brother, Paula had lived quietly, away from the political stage. She worked as a secretary, later under the surname Wolf, attempting to escape the shadow of her family name. Yet blood ties bound her to the dictator who had plunged the world into war, and for that reason alone, she was interrogated. The Allies wanted to know what she had seen, what she had heard, and whether she had been involved. But Paula's life was not one of influence. She was more a bystander than a conspirator. After questioning, she was released and faded once again into obscurity, living in Austria until her death in 1960. The photograph of her capture is striking because it reminds us that history's monsters do not exist in isolation. They have families, siblings, people who share their names but not their deeds. Paula Hitler's detention symbolizes the way war stains, even those who never held power, the innocent and the guilty alike, all caught in history's merciless grip. Inside Hitler's office, the new Reich Chancellery, 1939. In 1939, just months before the world would plunge into war, Adolf Hitler unveiled his new Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Designed by architect Albert Speer, the building was meant to impress, intimidate, and overwhelm anyone who walked its halls. And at its heart was the Führer's office, a cavernous room so vast and ornate that visitors felt dwarfed the moment they entered. Photographs show polished marble floors, towering ceilings, and walls lined with crimson drapery. The desk itself, enormous and dominating, symbolized authority and control. It wasn't just a workspace, it was a stage, crafted to project the illusion of absolute power. Every foreign dignitary, every German official summoned there was meant to feel small, insignificant, before the man who sat behind it. The new Reich Chancellery was not only an office but also a weapon of propaganda. Its architecture reflected the Nazi vision of grandeur, monumental, severe, and intimidating. Yet this monument to strength was built on the fragility of lies, and within just 6 years, Allied bombs reduced much of it to rubble. Looking back, the image of Hitler's office feels almost theatrical, an emperor's throne room for a man obsessed with appearances. Behind the polished stone and carefully staged grandeur lay paranoia, violence, and the fragile ego of a dictator whose empire would collapse as swiftly as it rose. Miners of West Virginia, the harsh heart of America, 1940. Deep beneath the rolling hills of West Virginia in the 1940 seconds, men descended into the earth to carve out the black rock that fueled a nation. A photograph from this era shows coal miners at work, their faces caked in soot, eyes peering through the dust with a quiet determination. Coal was the lifeblood of America's industrial engine. It powered factories, lit homes, and drove the locomotives that stitched the country together. But the price of that power was steep. For the miners, every shift meant crawling through darkness, choking on coal dust, and risking sudden death from cave-ins, explosions, or flooding. In West Virginia, entire communities were built around the mines. Families depended on the company not only for wages but also for housing, food, and even healthcare. Yet the workers lived under constant hardship, their lives shortened by black lung disease, their bodies worn down by relentless labor. Children grew up knowing that their fathers might never return from the pit, yet many followed them underground anyway. The photograph captures more than labor, it captures endurance. These men stood as symbols of both sacrifice and survival, their strength feeding a country that often overlooked their suffering. Today, when we look into their tired eyes, we are reminded that progress often comes from the hands of those buried deepest in its shadows. The horse pulled from the canal. Amsterdam, 1929. Amsterdam's beauty lies in its canals, winding like silver veins through the heart of the city. But those same waters often brought danger not to people, but to the animals that served them. In 1929, a striking photograph captured firefighters rescuing a horse that had fallen into one of the canals. The animal's eyes are wide with panic, its body slick and heavy as it struggles against the water. Ropes are fastened around its chest while men strain with all their strength to pull it free. Onlookers gather at the edge, their faces tense, silently willing the creature to survive. For centuries, horses were the lifeblood of Amsterdam's streets. They pulled carts, delivered goods, and carried people long before cars filled the city. But with canals cutting through nearly every neighborhood, accidents were inevitable. Rescuing a horse was no small feat. It demanded coordination, courage, and sheer physical will. This single image freezes a moment of compassion amid a hard era. In the midst of economic struggles and the looming shadows of a new war, people still fought to save an animal that could not save itself. The horse, soaked and trembling, became a symbol of resilience, and the rescuers, unsung heroes of a city where survival was often a shared struggle. Survivors of the charge of the Light Brigade, Crimea, 1854. In 1854, during the Crimean War, a military blunder gave birth to one of history's most tragic acts of bravery. At the Battle of Balaclava, miscommunication sent the British Light Brigade charging directly into the heart of Russian artillery fire. 600 cavalrymen rode into what Alfred, Lord Tennyson, would immortalize as the Valley of Death. The result was carnage. Horses fell screaming, riders were torn apart by cannon fire, and yet the charge did not falter. Through smoke and chaos, the Light Brigade pushed forward, their courage shining as brightly as their doom. Out of nearly 600, more than 100 died within minutes, and many more were wounded. Years later, a haunting photograph captured a small group of survivors standing together. Their faces are gaunt, their eyes distant, each man carrying the invisible weight of that fateful ride. The image is not one of triumph, but of endurance soldiers who lived to remember what others could not. The charge of the Light Brigade became both legend and warning. It embodied reckless orders, blind loyalty, and the terrible cost of war. And in those weathered faces of the survivors, we see not only bravery, but the sorrow of men who had ridden into history, knowing it was also a ride into death. The Dogs of War, trained heroes of World War I, 1917. In the mud-choked battlefields of World War I, where men fell by the thousands and communication often collapsed, help sometimes came on four legs. A remarkable photograph from 1917 shows dogs trained at the British War Dog Training School animals transformed into soldiers' silent allies. These dogs carried messages through shell fire when telegraph lines were cut. They delivered medical supplies across no man's land, weaving between craters and barbed wire. Some were even trained to find the wounded, their keen noses guiding rescuers to soldiers hidden beneath rubble or lying in the mud, unseen and forgotten. They were fast, fearless, and loyal beyond comprehension. While soldiers carried rifles, these dogs carried hope, small pouches strapped to their sides, letters clutched in their jaws, lifelines that could mean the difference between life and death. The photograph is haunting and tender all at once. You see the bond between man and animal, forged not in comfort but in chaos. These dogs never understood politics or borders, only trust and duty. And in the silence of the trenches, when despair seemed endless, the bark of a war dog could remind a soldier that he was not alone. History remembers battles, generals, and treaties, but in that single photo, we are reminded of the unsung heroes, tails wagging, paws muddy, hearts unbreakable, who carried courage across a shattered world. Fireworks in London, Payne's factory, 1928. In the heart of London, long before the era of computer-programmed pyrotechnics, the magic of fireworks was born in places like Payne's fireworks factory. A photograph from 1928 shows workers carefully preparing explosives, powders, and casings, ordinary men and women whose hands crafted the brilliant spectacles that lit up Britain's skies. Payne's was no small operation. It was one of the most famous producers of fireworks in the world, supplying grand displays for royal celebrations, national holidays, and local festivals alike. Yet behind the dazzling shows was painstaking, dangerous labor. Every sparkler, every rocket was assembled by hand, with the ever-present risk of fire or explosion. One slip, one stray ember, could turn celebration into tragedy. The image captures a curious duality: the grim faces of workers in overalls handling volatile chemicals, contrasted with the joy their craft would soon bring to thousands. These were the unseen architects of wonder, transforming raw powder into bursts of color that would soar into the night sky. Today, fireworks are a symbol of joy, unity, and celebration. But in that photograph of Payne's factory, we are reminded that even beauty can be born from risk, and that every moment of awe beneath a glittering sky once began with someone's steady hands in the shadows. Learning to climb poles, University of Michigan, 1918. In 1918, as the world was still at war and technology was racing forward, a striking photograph captured young men learning an unusual but essential skill: pole climbing. At the University of Michigan, students of the Student Army Training Corps were instructed in telephone electrician training, shimmying up tall wooden poles with ropes and spikes strapped to their boots. The image shows a line of students mid-climb, their bodies tense, gripping the poles as instructors barked directions from below. It may seem mundane now, but at the time this training was critical. Communication on the battlefield and at home depended on telephone lines. If they fell, messages stopped, and armies could collapse into chaos. For these young men, climbing wasn't just practice, it was preparation for survival. They were learning to restore connections in the middle of war zones, often under fire, with lives depending on whether a single wire could carry a voice across the front. The photograph captures both the innocence of youth and the urgency of war. The students wear the determination of soldiers, but still look like boys, caught between adolescence and responsibility. They didn't yet know where the war would take them, but in that moment, clinging to wooden poles in Michigan, they were already carrying the weight of a world desperate to stay connected. The Mine Rescuer. Into the depths. 1920 seconds. In the dangerous world beneath the earth, where explosions, collapses, and poison gases claimed countless lives, few figures were more heroic than the Mine Rescuer. A rare photograph from the 1920 seconds shows a rescuer outfitted with strange, almost alien-looking gear, a bulky breathing apparatus strapped to his chest, a safety lamp glowing faintly in his hand, and heavy boots built for endurance in the dark. His job was simple in words, impossible in reality to go where no one else dared. When disaster struck, when tunnels filled with choking fumes or flames cut off escape, rescuers descended into the depths to find the living and recover the dead. They often worked blind in pitch blackness, each step an act of defiance against fear. The breathing apparatus, primitive by today's standards, gave them only minutes of precious air. Every second ticked away as they crawled through collapsed passages, listening for the faint cries of men buried alive. Many rescuers never returned. For them, saving others meant sacrificing themselves without hesitation. The photograph freezes one such man in stoic silence, armored not with weapons but with courage. He represents the quiet bravery of those who chose not to fight wars above ground, but to wage battles against death itself in the suffocating dark. His image stands as a tribute to the forgotten guardians of the mines, men who risked everything so that others might live. The wooden giant, the Sibley Breaker, early 1900 seconds. Rising above the landscape like a cathedral of industry, the Sibley Breaker in Pennsylvania was once the largest coal processing plant in the world. Built entirely of wood, a common but dangerous practice at the time, it stood as a towering symbol of America's hunger for progress in the early 20th century. Photographs show its vast framework of beams and planks, stretching skyward in sharp, angular lines. Inside, the roar of machinery never stopped. Coal tumbled down chutes, workers sorted through mountains of black rock, and clouds of dust choked the air until every breath was a battle. For miners and their families, the breaker was both lifeline and curse. It provided jobs, but it also consumed lives. The choice of wood made construction faster and cheaper, but it also turned the building into a tinderbox. Fires were a constant fear, and eventually, what seemed like an unstoppable giant met its inevitable fate, reduced to ash by the very danger it had carried within its walls from the beginning. Looking at the photograph today, the Sibley breaker feels like a relic from another world, a time when ambition ran ahead of safety, when progress was measured in sheer scale, no matter the cost. It is a reminder of how quickly even the mightiest structures can vanish, leaving only black dust and fading photographs behind. Sailors and the Sea Mine, World War I, 1916. In 1916, during the height of World War I, 3 sailors posed beside a captured German naval mine. At first glance, the photograph might seem almost casual, men standing next to a strange, spiked sphere. But in truth, that steel monster was one of the deadliest weapons of the sea. Naval mines were designed to float just beneath the water's surface, waiting silently for ships to pass. Once struck, their detonators would unleash an explosion powerful enough to rip open a battleship's hull and send it plunging to the ocean floor. Entire fleets could be crippled by these hidden killers, which required no crew, no orders, just patience and silence. For sailors, the fear of mines was constant. You could not see them, you could not hear them. The sea itself became a trap, turning every voyage into a gamble. Clearing them demanded immense courage, as crews risked their lives towing and disarming explosives that could erupt with the slightest touch. In the photograph, the 3 men stand with a grim pride beside the weapon that once threatened their lives. To them, the mine was more than steel, it was the embodiment of invisible death, now rendered harmless. Their pose is not boastful, but relieved, as if simply surviving the presence of such a device was victory enough. Pouring the Hoover Dam, America's concrete colossus, 1933. In the scorching Nevada desert of 1933, men labored like ants at the base of what would become one of America's greatest engineering triumphs, the Hoover Dam. A photograph captures them pouring concrete into massive wooden frames, each block called a lift, designed to cool slowly and prevent cracking. The scale was staggering. So much concrete was used that, had it been poured all at once, it would have taken more than a century to harden. Instead, the dam was built piece by piece, block by block, until it rose as a colossal wall against the Colorado River, holding back floods, generating power, and reshaping the American West forever. For the workers, it was grueling and perilous labor. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees, men dangled from precarious heights, and deadly accidents were frequent. Yet they endured, driven by both the promise of steady wages during the Great Depression and the sheer pride of building something that would outlast them all. When completed in 1936, the Hoover Dam stood not just as concrete and steel, but as a monument to human ambition and sacrifice. The photograph of those men pouring concrete into the foundation freezes the moment when vision began to take shape. Ordinary hands, shaping an extraordinary future. Caligula's lost ships, treasures from Lake Nemi, 1st century rediscovered. In the tranquil waters of Lake Nemi, Italy, history slept for nearly 2,000 years. Beneath the surface lay the remains of 2 massive ships built by one of Rome's most infamous emperors, Caligula. These weren't warships, but floating palaces, symbols of excess and divine vanity. A photograph taken in 1933 shows one of the anchors raised from the depths, a relic of a forgotten empire finally returned to the light. The ships themselves, constructed in the 1st century, were marvels of engineering, equipped with marble floors, mosaics, heating systems, even rotating statues. They were said to have been used for lavish ceremonies and personal indulgence, proof of Caligula's obsession with grandeur. For centuries, fishermen spoke of strange timbers visible beneath the waters, but it wasn't until Mussolini ordered the lake drained in the 1932 that the ships were fully revealed. Their rediscovery stunned the world, offering a glimpse into Rome's most extravagant age. But history can be cruel. During World War II, the ships housed in a museum were destroyed in a fire, their wooden frames lost forever. Only fragments, photographs, and artifacts like that ancient anchor remain. The image of the anchor is haunting, a piece of metal, once holding steady a floating palace, now the last witness to Caligula's drowned dreams. It reminds us how power, no matter how vast, eventually sinks beneath the weight of time. Maurice Tillet, the French angel of wrestling, 1,940 seconds. In the world of professional wrestling during the 1,940 seconds, few figures were as unforgettable as Maurice Tillet, known to fans as the French Angel. A photograph from his career shows a man with a broad, almost inhuman face, yet eyes that seemed gentle, almost sorrowful. Tillet had once been handsome, but in his 20s he developed acromegaly, a rare condition that caused his bones to thicken and his features to grow exaggerated. What could have been a curse became, in the ring, his unique strength. Promoters billed him as a villain, a terrifying figure whose very presence drew gasps from crowds. And yet, behind the spectacle, Tillet was no monster. He was intelligent, spoke several languages, and loved literature. His life was a story of resilience, of turning what fate had given him into something unforgettable. His fame carried him across America, where he became a global wrestling sensation, his nickname cemented in history. Many later whispered that Maurice Tillet was the inspiration for the animated character Shrek. Whether true or not, his legacy endures as a reminder that appearances deceive. The photograph of the French Angel captures this paradox perfectly. A face the world could not forget, and a man whose spirit was far more complex than the mask he wore in the ring. Building skyscrapers, New York's fearless workers, 1,930, high above the streets of New York in 1930, men balanced on narrow steel beams, their bodies silhouetted against the open sky. One famous photograph shows a construction worker carrying a heavy sack across a beam no wider than his boot, hundreds of feet above the ground, with no safety harness, no net, and nothing between him and death but his balance. These were the builders of America's skyline, the anonymous heroes of the skyscraper age. They worked with nerves of steel, moving casually through the clouds while the city bustled far below. To them, fear was a luxury they could not afford. Every step, every lifted beam, every rivet hammered into place was another piece of the modern world rising into existence. Their courage came at a cost. Accidents were common, and many never made it home. Yet they kept climbing, driven by pride, by the promise of steady wages during the Great Depression, and by the knowledge that their work would change the face of the city forever. The photograph freezes that raw mixture of danger and determination. It is a portrait of a time when progress demanded not machines, but men willing to risk everything dangling above the void to build monuments of steel and stone. Looking at it now, we feel both awe and dread, reminded that the price of ambition is often written in human lives. Manet's painting hidden in a vault, Germany, 1945. In the final days of World War II, as Allied troops advanced into Germany, they uncovered not only weapons and ruins, but treasures the world had nearly lost. On the 25th of April, 1945, deep inside an underground vault, soldiers discovered a painting by the French impressionist Edouard Manet Don Lescaut. The photograph of its recovery feels almost surreal. Dusty soldiers holding a masterpiece, its canvas fragile but intact, rescued from the darkness. The painting was part of the vast collection of art and cultural treasures looted by the Nazis and hidden away in secret bunkers, caves, and mines across Europe. To the regime, art was both a prize and a weapon, symbols of power hoarded as spoils of war. But here, in that underground vault, Manet's brushstrokes came back to light. For a moment, amid the chaos of a world collapsing, beauty survived. The soldiers who stumbled upon it weren't art historians, yet they understood they were holding something larger than themselves, a piece of humanity preserved against destruction. The image of Don Lescaut, emerging from the shadows, is more than the story of one painting. It is the story of countless works, nearly erased by greed and violence, saved only by chance. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, art endures fragile, silent, but eternal. The golden bust of Marcus Aurelius, Switzerland, 1939. In 1939, as Europe braced for another world war, archaeologists in Switzerland unearthed a treasure from a much older empire. Hidden for centuries in an ancient sewer beneath the Roman city of Aventicum, they discovered a gleaming gilded bust of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The photograph of the find is striking, the serene, thoughtful face of the philosopher, king emerging from the earth, its golden surface shining against the dirt of centuries. Marcus Aurelius, remembered as one of Rome's greatest emperors and the author of Meditations, had been lost to time here, buried where filth once flowed. Aventicum, the capital of the Roman province of Helvetia, had been a thriving hub of culture and politics. That such a masterpiece was hidden in its sewers remains a mystery. Was it stashed away during a time of invasion to protect it? Was it discarded as the empire crumbled, only to be rediscovered nearly 2 millennia later? What is certain is the symbolism. Just as Europe prepared to plunge into chaos in 1939, this relic of wisdom and stoicism resurfaced a reminder from history that empires rise and fall, but ideas endure. The bust of Marcus Aurelius, calm and unshaken, looked out once more upon a world in turmoil, as if to whisper the words he once wrote, "The universe is change, life is opinion." Sammy Davis Jr. steps into the ring, 1,950 seconds. In the mid-1,950 seconds, long before he became a global entertainment icon, Sammy Davis Jr. found himself in an unexpected spotlight, not on stage, but inside a boxing ring. A photograph captures the moment. Davis, slight in build, receiving final instructions from a towering professional boxing champion before a celebrity exhibition match. The scene is almost playful yet carries a strange tension. Surrounded by flashing cameras and cheering crowds, the entertainer who dazzled audiences with song and dance now prepared to throw punches. Celebrity bouts like this were a popular spectacle of the time, designed to blur the lines between sport and show business, raising money for charity while giving the public a chance to see their idols in a new light. Sammy Davis Jr., with his natural charisma, leaned into the moment. Though far from a trained fighter, he stepped into the ring with courage, laughter, and the energy that would define his career. The photograph shows him not as the polished star of the Rat Pack, but as a man willing to entertain in any arena, even one where the spotlight came with bruises. Looking back, it's more than a novelty snapshot. It's a reminder that Davis's brilliance lay not just in his talent, but in his fearless embrace of life. Whether under stage lights or boxing lights, he lived to perform and the world loved him for it. Liberty ships, America's wartime assembly line, 1,940 seconds. During World War II, the oceans became battlegrounds, and cargo ships were as vital as tanks and planes. To supply the Allies, America launched an audacious project, the rapid construction of Liberty ships. At the Bethlehem Fairfield shipyards in Maryland, a photograph from 1943 shows workers swarming over half-finished hulls, steel beams rising like skeletons of giants against the sky. The Liberty ships were built with one purpose: speed. Designed for mass production, they could be assembled in mere weeks. Welders, riveters, and laborers worked around the clock, many of them women who had stepped into industrial roles for the first time. Each ship, plain and sturdy, carried weapons, food, fuel, and troops across the Atlantic, lifelines for armies fighting far from home. The scale of the achievement was staggering. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were launched, turning American shipyards into the beating heart of the Allied war effort. To sailors, these ships were not glamorous, but they were dependable, carrying their precious cargo through seas prowled by German U-boats. The photograph captures more than machinery, it shows determination. Ordinary workers, fueled by patriotism and necessity, pieced together steel giants that would help decide the fate of the war. Today, when we look at those Liberty ships, we see not just vessels of war, but symbols of unity and the sheer power of human will when survival is at stake. The ball turret gunner, trapped in the sky, 1,940 seconds, beneath the belly of the B-17 bomber, hung one of the most terrifying positions in all of military aviation, the ball turret. A small glass sphere with twin machine guns, it rotated to defend the bomber from enemy fighters, and inside it, curled into a fetal position, sat the ball turret gunner. A haunting photograph shows the cramped sphere, barely large enough for a man. Once sealed inside, the gunner had no escape during flight. His knees hugged his chest, his hands clutched the triggers, and his view of the world was nothing but sky, tracer fire, and the enemy closing in. It was a job of courage and claustrophobia. The gunner was the most vulnerable member of the crew suspended beneath the plane, with no room for a parachute. If the landing gear failed, or if flak ripped through the fuselage, he often had no way out. Many never returned from their missions, and yet, despite the terror, these young men climbed into that sphere day after day. They fought not only enemy aircraft, but also fear itself, turning a coffin of glass and steel into a shield for their comrades above. The image of the ball turret gunner remains one of World War II's most haunting symbols, a reminder of the extraordinary bravery of ordinary men, trapped between earth and sky. Blade Runner on set, Rutger Hauer, 1982. In 1982, cinema was forever changed by the neon-soaked, rain-drenched vision of Blade Runner. Among its unforgettable images is a behind-the-scenes photograph of Rutger Hauer on set, dressed as Roy Batty the replicant, who would become one of science fiction's most iconic characters. The photo captures Hauer with his platinum blonde hair, piercing eyes, and that air of both menace and melancholy. Behind the camera, the world was just Hollywood scaffolding and set lights, but in front of it, Hauer transformed into something else entirely. Not just a villain, but a tragic figure searching for meaning in a world that denied him humanity. Director Ridley Scott's dystopian Los Angeles was built with rain machines, miniature cityscapes, and smoke-filled backlots. Yet the illusion was so powerful that even raw photographs from the set feel otherworldly. And Hauer, improvising lines and shaping Roy Batty's soul, breathed life into the film's most enduring moment, his Tears in Rain farewell, later hailed as one of cinema's greatest monologues. The image of Hauer on set is more than a snapshot of a movie production. It is a glimpse into the making of a legend, into the moment when a science fiction thriller became timeless poetry. His gaze seems to look beyond the camera, perhaps, toward the immortality he achieved, not as a replicant, but as an actor who gave a machine a soul. Douglas Trumbull and the future of film. Blade Runner, 1982. If Blade Runner dazzled audiences with its haunting, futuristic world, much of the credit belongs to a man who rarely stood in front of the camera, Douglas Trumbull, the visual effects genius. A photograph from 1982 shows him on set, quietly overseeing the miniature cityscapes and lighting rigs that would give Ridley Scott's dystopian Los Angeles its unforgettable look. Trumbull was already a legend, having worked on 2001, A Space Odyssey and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But in Blade Runner, he perfected a style that fused science fiction with gritty realism. He layered smoke, neon, and rain over towering models of skyscrapers, blending them with live-action shots until the line between illusion and reality vanished. The photograph captures his meticulous presence, adjusting lights, fine-tuning perspectives, always searching for the perfect balance between technology and artistry. Unlike today's digital effects, every frame had to be built by hand, filmed with precision, and often reshot countless times. What Trumbull achieved was more than spectacle. He created a future that felt lived in, worn, and real. A vision so powerful it became the blueprint for decades of science fiction. Looking at that image of him on set, one realizes that his quiet work shaped not just a film, but the way we imagine tomorrow itself. VJ Day in New York. The streets of celebration, 1945. On the 14th of August, 1945, the streets of New York City erupted into a tidal wave of joy. The news had just broken. Japan had surrendered, and the most devastating war in human history was finally over. A photograph from that day shows sidewalks buried in confetti and torn paper, the air alive with cheers, laughter, and tears of relief. For years, the city had lived in the shadow of war ration books, casualty reports, the constant dread of telegrams bringing tragic news. But on VJ Day, all of that was released in a single, breathtaking outpouring. Strangers embraced, sailors kissed nurses, and office workers leaned out of windows, showering the streets with ticker tape. It was as if the entire metropolis had decided to breathe at once. Yet beneath the celebration was something deeper. Those smiling faces had endured years of sacrifice. Every hug, every kiss, every tear was shadowed by the memory of the millions who would never return. The joy was real, but so was the grief stitched into it. The photograph of New Yorkers surrounded by confetti captures more than victory, it captures catharsis. A nation exhaling after years of fear, a moment when hope returned, fragile but shining, like paper fluttering down from the sky. Protest at the Binnenhof. the abortion debate, 1974. In October 1974, the usually serene political heart of the Netherlands, the Binnenhof in The Hague, became the stage for a fierce clash of values. A photograph from that day shows two crowds facing each other. Pro-abortion activists demanding change, and opponents determined to preserve tradition. Their banners fluttered in the autumn air, their voices rising against one another in a storm of passion. The Netherlands was in the midst of profound social transformation. Questions of personal freedom, morality, and law collided in ways the country had never experienced so publicly. The abortion debate was not merely about medicine, it was about women's rights, religious influence, and the direction of modern society. In the photograph, faces are tense, arguments frozen mid-shout. Some stand with conviction, fists raised, while others clutch rosaries or signs calling for restraint. The Binnenhof, centuries old, had witnessed royal decrees and political reforms, but now it was absorbing something raw, the pulse of a people divided. Looking back, the image captures more than a single protest. It shows democracy in action, messy, loud, and emotional. The Netherlands would eventually legalize abortion under specific conditions in 1984, but in that frozen moment of 1974, the outcome was far from certain. The photograph remains a testament to how deeply societies struggle when the future collides with tradition. The first conquest of Everest, Hillary and Tenzing, 1953. On May 29, 1953, the world's highest peak finally bowed to human determination. A historic photograph shows Sir Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay, the Sherpa from Nepal, standing triumphantly on the summit of Mount Everest. For centuries, the mountain had been seen as unconquerable, a frozen fortress in the clouds. But on that day, man stood atop it for the very first time. The journey was brutal. The thin air clawed at their lungs, the icy slopes threatened to swallow them whole, and every step was a battle against exhaustion. Yet Hillary and Tenzing pushed upward, driven by a will stronger than the mountain's silence. When they finally reached the summit, they stood not just for themselves but for all humanity, proof that even the greatest barriers can be broken. The photograph radiates something more than achievement. In Hillary's steady stance and Tenzing's proud presence with his ice axe, you see courage and unity across cultures. Two men from opposite worlds bound together by the shared triumph of survival and conquest. News of their success swept across the globe, a moment of joy in a post-war world hungry for hope. The image of those two figures on the rooftop of the earth became immortal, a reminder that no matter how high the peak, no matter how impossible the climb, human spirit will always reach for the summit. Scene 37. The fallen tree of Pacific Grove, California's wild coast, 1,950 seconds. Along the rugged shoreline of Pacific Grove, California, the Pacific Ocean has always ruled with untamed power. In the 1,950 seconds, a photograph captured a massive cypress tree lying fallen across the rocks, its twisted branches reaching helplessly toward the sea. The image is quiet, almost melancholy. For decades, the tree had withstood fierce winds and relentless waves, its roots clinging stubbornly to the cliffs. But nature is patient, and in time, even giants fall. The storm winds finally claimed it, toppling it into a sculpture of defeat and resilience all at once. Pacific Grove was already celebrated for its breathtaking natural beauty, windswept trees, craggy coastlines, and the endless roar of the Pacific. Yet this single fallen tree became a symbol of the delicate balance between strength and fragility. Even the mightiest, shaped by years of resistance, eventually yield to time. Looking at the photograph today, one can almost hear the ocean crashing against the rocks, taste the salt in the air, and feel the strange peace of endings. The fallen cypress reminds us that nothing lasts forever, and that in surrendering to nature, there can still be a kind of quiet dignity. Scene 38. The cement mixer that became a spaceship. Oklahoma, 1971. In 1971, a bizarre accident near Winganon, Oklahoma, left behind a piece of industrial wreckage that would, over time, transform into a local legend. A cement truck had veered off the road, and though the cab was hauled away, the massive mixer drum was simply too heavy to move. Abandoned in a field, it sat like a stranded relic, forgotten, rusting, useless. But then something remarkable happened. Locals, rather than seeing an eyesore, saw potential. They began repainting and decorating the enormous drum, each new layer of imagination reshaping it. Over the years, it was transformed into a mock NASA space capsule complete with windows, hatches, and insignias. A photograph of the repainted mixer shows children climbing on it, laughing, as if it truly had fallen from the stars. What began as a mishap became a work of community art, a playful reminder that creativity can redeem even the most unlikely of objects. The Winganon space capsule, as it came to be called, still rests in that field today. To passers-by, it looks like a piece of science fiction embedded in the Oklahoma countryside. To locals, it is a story of humor, resilience, and imagination, proof that even an accident can, with a little vision, become a symbol of wonder.